Welcome to the Crunch McDabbles Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles. This is the only show where we take a deep dive into the Pathfinder Second Edition rules. In today's show, we're going to break down and compare all the weapon proficiency bonuses for each class. I wanted to break down all these proficiency progressions for each class to look for patterns to make this easier to understand and compare classes. This information will be useful for two reasons. One, it will help you understand the rules better and be able to help people at your table. And two, it will be very useful for deciding on and planning out your character builds. So let's start at the beginning. What is a proficiency rank? Proficiency ranks in Pathfinder Second Edition are a progression from untrained to trained to expert to master to legendary. Those are all the stages. If you're untrained, you get no bonus and you can't even add your level to your bonus. If you're trained, you get a +2 plus your level. If you're expert, you get a +4 plus your level. If you're a master, you get +6 plus your level. And if you're legendary, you get +8 plus your level. All classes start off at least trained in some group of weapons. Then at certain levels, they progress up to the next level of proficiency. Basically, as each class levels, they get better at using certain weapons. So we want to compare these progressions and find the trends. When we did the breakdown of each class and their proficiency progression, we found that many classes were the same. There were indeed trends here in the rule set. So we identified 4 groups that each class fell into. The 4 groups are as follows, working from best to worst. So the first package we have, the first of our 4 packages, this is the deluxe package, the cream of the ice cream. The fighter is the only class that gets in on this one. It starts at expert right away instead of trained where everyone else starts. And at level 5 it moves to master, and then at level 13 it progresses to legendary. Actually, this is the only package that progresses to legendary, so it's pretty great. The second group, we'll call this one the Pretty Good Martial group. There's nothing to slouch about in this one. It starts off as trained, but at 5th level it advances to expert, and then at 13th level it advances to master. Now the progressions are at the same levels as the deluxe group. It just is one stage behind because it starts off at trained instead of expert. But because it makes 2 progressions throughout the 20 levels, it ends up at master at 13th level and not legendary. This is pretty great though. The next 2 groups don't even get to master. So as I said, there's nothing to slouch about in this progression. Now the 3rd and 4th group, they're both pretty similar. They both start at trained, but they only have 1 progression throughout the 20 levels instead of 2. So these only advance to expert. So no master and no legend in these groups. It only goes to expert. The only difference between these 2 lower tier groups, as I said, they're similar, is when they progress to expert. So we'll call group 3, we'll call this one the slightly better than awful group. It starts at trained, but then at level 7 advances to expert, and it stays at expert straight on through until level 20. Now group 4, we'll call this group the good thing they can cast spells group. And it starts at trained and advances to expert, but not until level 11. So we see here the difference is these 4 levels in here where group 3 advances to expert at level 7 and group 4 has to wait until level 11. But otherwise it's more or less the same. Now there is one more group, although it's not associated with the class, we may as well talk about it here quickly. It shows up by taking feats, either through the ancestry feats, where you take, say, dwarf or elf weapon familiarity, or through the fighter dedication feat. These feats allow you to be trained with a certain set of weapons and then progress to expert at level 13. So it's even worse than the lowest of the 4 class progressions. But these are probably more about getting access to more weapons than they are about gaining proficiency. But we mention it anyways for comparison. Now, Before any of us go getting any of our undergarments into any sort of bunched up configuration, because we're concerned that the fighter is legendary but I'm only expert, let's look at how this actually breaks down on a graph to see the difference, so we can see that it's not a huge difference. And we like graphs here, so let's do this. So here is the fighter mapped out. That is the deluxe progression, the best of the best. And you can see that we're adding the proficiency bonus to our level at each level and seeing how this bonus is through levels 1 through 20. And we can see that there are the bumps at level 5 and level 13 as your proficiency increases. But otherwise, it just progresses linearly, +1 each level. When we add the pretty good martial group for comparison, we see that it's exactly the same the whole way through. It's just 2 points behind the deluxe package the whole way. Even the other less desirable progressions, at any point they're only 4 behind it, and at some points they catch up to within 2. So the overall takeaway here has to be that there's some difference between the classes, but it's not a deal breaker. At most it's only 4 difference. But speaking of classes, let's get into what class fits into each progression, and you can play along at home to see if you can guess where each class should go. Starting in alphabetical order, the alchemist, the bomb-throwing master of mixing. Where does this one go? The alchemist is trained in simple weapons and goes into the slightly better than awful group. Not the worst, but not that great. The barbarian, the brawler with the big biceps. Surely this one is deluxe. But it's not. It's just a pretty good martial, but it does get access to all martial weapons, so that's pretty good. How about the bard, the relentless rake with the rapier? This one must be a fairly decent martial class, right? It gets simple weapons plus the longsword, rapier, sap, short bow, short sword, and whip. It must be up there in the decent martial progression, right? But no, it falls way down to the at least I have spells category, so that's pretty interesting. How about the champion, that determined deadly deist? This one goes in the pretty good martial group. Not deluxe, but not bad either. It does include all martial weapons, so the champion, not that bad. Then there's the cleric. Now this one, the cleric is interesting because it splits into 2 depending on your doctrine. If you're a cloistered cleric, those sheltered clerics, you drop down to the way bottom, to the at least you have spells group. And that's sort of expected, because that's more of a spellcasting cleric. But what about the war priest? What about those holy warriors wielding their deity's favored weapon with furious anger? War priests jump all the way up to not much higher, 1 step above this to the slightly better than awful group, but you can still cast spells. So keep in mind too that the cleric has a limited weapon list, just simple weapons plus the 1 deity favored weapon. So the cleric has both limited weapon choices and a limited progression. And then there's the druid. Well, you might want to just stay in animal form for this one because you're only getting simple weapons and you're in the lowest group. You're in the at least you can cast spells group. So sorry about that, druids. Weapons aren't your thing. The fighter, we talked about this one already. Fighter, you go straight up to the deluxe group. You're the only one in this category. But don't get too full of yourself. At best, you're only getting +4 better than a wizard with your weapon. You do get all the martial weapons, of course, and you do get to become legendary, so that's good for you. The investigator, that nerd that notices everything. Does this one go down with the spellcasters? No, this one actually is up in the martial sphere. They get all martial weapons. So this is a bona fide martial class. So don't mess with Sherlock Holmes. You want to get in on this? Record something? Then we move on to the monk, that professor of pummel. What does the monk get? Well, they only get simple weapons. So right off the bat, that's not as good. But it really doesn't matter for a monk because all they really need is their unarmed attacks anyways. But they fit right in up here, up with their martial counterparts, up in the pretty decent martial category. So good for them. And then how about the Oracle? Yeah. Right off the bat, the Oracle is way down at the bottom group in the at least they can cast spells group. But what about the Oracle of Battle? The Oracle Battle, of course, goes way, way, way up to exactly the same place. The Oracle of Battle has the same proficiency. They just get more weapons. They get a weapon group. And moving on to the Ranger, that wandering warrior in the woods. Yeah, you know where they go. They've been in the same place since first edition AD&D, right up there with all the other martials. And they get martial weapon proficiency too, so they are in a good spot. And so moving on to the Rogue, where does the Rogue go? The Rogue's always been down in this slightly better than awful range, but not anymore. In second edition Pathfinder, they are up there with the pretty good martial group, so good for them. It's great for them, that's great. The weapons aren't great though. They get simple weapons, the rapier, the sap, the short bow, and the short sword. Those are actually pretty good complementary weapons, but it's only a few more weapons plus simple weapons, and that's it. But at least they're pretty well proficient with that small group of weapons. But they can become masters of the short sword or masters of the sap or whatever they want to do. Now comes the sorcerer with all their innate magical power. And it's a good thing that they have that, because they are down here in the lowest tier. But they do have access to all simple weapons, which is something. So you could be a wizard, right, and have hardly access to any weapons. You do get all simple weapons, although you are in the lowest tier as a sorcerer. And then there's the swashbuckler. Are they deluxe? Do they go up in the top tier? Nope. But they are pretty good. They get all martial weapons, and they're in that pretty good martial category. And then there's the witch, those mysterious ministers of the mystique. They get simple weapons, and yep, they go way down in the lowest group, so it's a good thing that they have spells. And finally, it's the wizard. Good thing we saved the worst for last, because this is the worst warrior with weapons. Not only are they in the lowest group, but they don't even get simple weapons. They just get 5 weapons, and 2 of the 5 weapons are the same. They get the club, the crossbow, the staff, the dagger, and the heavy crossbow. So there you have it. Pretty bad. So there you have it. Those are the 4 tiers of weapon proficiencies and where each class fits in. Now you can help people at your table remember where they are supposed to be, and you have some more insight into planning out your own builds. So maybe a fighter with the cleric archetype is more in line with what you picture for your character than a straight up battle cleric. Or maybe you see that the rogue has all this martial potential, but a really awful set of weapons. So choosing an ancestry with a good weapon set could augment your roguish ruffian racketeer. The choices are up to you, but at least now you have the overview. And that is it. That's the Crunch McDabble Show. I've been your host, Crunch McDabbles, making the RPG dreams come true. It's an imaginary world out there fraught with real dangers, so be safe out there.